Gang wars inside Rikers, when loyalties turned deadly. The cellblock was already loud, but then it turned into pure chaos. Shouts echoed off the concrete walls as two groups of inmates, both armed with makeshift blades, rushed at each other. The floor was slick, bodies crashed into metal bunks, and correction officers froze for a split second. This wasn't just another fight. This was a war. Two gangs, once allies, now enemies, tearing into each other in a battle for control. What started as loyalty turned into betrayal, and now blood was being spilled on the cold floor of Rikers Island. But how did it come to this? What could make men who once stood shoulder to shoulder suddenly want each other dead? To understand, we have to go back. Rikers Island has always been a place where power is everything. If you don't have protection, you're a target. And if you don't belong to a crew, you're as good as alone. Two gangs, let's call them the Wolves and the Serpents, were once bound together, sharing food, contraband, even protecting each other during shakedowns. For months, they held the cellblock under tight control, keeping rival groups in check and even intimidating some of the guards. But cracks started to show. A shipment of contraband, cell phones, tobacco, and pain pills went missing. Each side blamed the other. Whispered words spread in the yard. Eyes narrowed across the mess hall. The bond that once held the Wolves and Serpents together was now breaking apart. The tension simmered for weeks, with small flare-ups, a shove during rec time, a tray knocked over in the chow line. Threats hissed between bunks after lights out. Everyone in the block could feel it. The air thick with anger, betrayal, and the promise of something big about to happen. Even the correction officers knew to stay extra alert, because in Rikers, small sparks turn into fires fast. Then came the moment that set it all off. One night, during a tense card game, an argument over owed money exploded. Words became shouts, shouts became threats, and then one of the wolves pulled a sharpened piece of metal from his waistband. Before anyone could react, he lunged. The block erupted, and just like that, the fragile peace between the Wolves and Serpents shattered forever. The fight spread like wildfire, spilling across tiers, metal scraping on metal, fists pounding, alarms blaring. Correction officers rushed in with shields, but they were outnumbered, caught in the middle of a storm. This was no longer about cards or missing contraband. It was about revenge, respect, and survival. And in that moment, Rikers Island became a battlefield. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would push the jail to its breaking point. The sirens screamed, red lights flashing across the tier as officers stormed in with riot shields. But by the time they reached the block, the gangs were already locked in a frenzy. Inmates screamed war cries, makeshift blades flashing in the dim light. Some used broken broom handles, others swung locks stuffed in socks. The Wolves and the Serpents were no longer just fighting. They were trying to destroy each other. Correction officers tried to separate the mobs, but every time they pulled two apart, three more clashed behind them. Radios crackled, calling for backup. Reinforcements flooded in, but the block was slipping out of their control. In the middle of the chaos, one of the Serpents went down. His crew dragged him back against the wall, blood on his shirt. The Wolves saw it as a chance to push harder, to break their rivals completely. They surged forward with a force that shook the entire block. The Serpents fought back just as hard, refusing to give an inch. The noise was deafening, metal slamming, fists connecting, boots pounding the concrete.
For some inmates, the fight wasn't even about loyalty anymore. It was about survival. If you stood still, you got trampled. If you hesitated, you got cut. Even those who weren't part of either gang were dragged into the storm, forced to pick sides or be swallowed by it. One correction officer shouted orders, his voice hoarse, but no one listened. It was too late. Tear gas canisters were fired into the block. Smoke spread, burning eyes and throats, but it didn't stop the violence. It only made the fighting more desperate, more savage. Then, out of the haze, something happened that no one expected. A member of the Wolves, known for being one of the toughest, suddenly turned on his own. He struck another wolf, dropping him to the ground. The Serpents froze, confused. Even the officers hesitated. In that instant, the fragile line between loyalty and betrayal snapped in half. If the wolves couldn't even trust their own, what chance did anyone have of walking out of this alive? The battle had started as a war between two gangs, but now it was turning into something much darker, every man for himself. And just as the officers tried to regain control, a new sound cut through the madness, the pounding of boots rushing toward the block. Reinforcements were finally here, but were they too late? The heavy metal door slammed open, and a wave of correction officers in full riot gear charged in. Shields locked, batons raised, helmets gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Their boots thundered on the floor as they pushed into the smoke-filled cell block. The gangs barely noticed at first. They were too deep in the fight. But when the line of officers advanced, shouting commands, slamming their shields against the concrete, the tide began to shift. Inmates scattered, some retreating into cells, others climbing onto bunks to avoid the charge. Still, the most hardened wolves and serpents stood their ground, eyes burning with rage. The officers unleashed pepper spray, thick streams hitting faces and sending men reeling, coughing, and clawing at their eyes. Batons came down hard, thudding against arms, legs, and backs. It wasn't enough to calm the storm. It only fueled the chaos. Some inmates fought the officers too, swinging wildly, anything to keep from being taken down. One wolf, his face streaked with blood, locked eyes with a serpent across the block. Even through the haze, their hatred was clear. Ignoring the officers between them, both lunged forward, crashing into each other like wild animals. They rolled across the floor, fists flying, blades flashing. It took 3 officers to rip them apart, dragging them in opposite directions. The noise was overwhelming. Radios squawked, alarms screamed. Smoke hung so thick it blurred faces. Officers shouted names, calling for cuffs, for restraints, for stretchers. The entire block looked like a war zone. And then came the worst sound of all, a sharp, chilling scream. Through the smoke, one inmate staggered forward, clutching his side. His white uniform turned red as he collapsed to the ground. Officers swarmed, but the damage was done. The gangs saw it as a message. One of their own had been taken out, and there would be no forgiveness. Even as officers pinned men to the floor, zip-tying wrists and dragging bodies toward the exit, the gangs shouted threats that shook the walls. "This isn't over! You're dead when the lights go out!" The officers knew the fight was far from finished. Tonight, they had managed to drag the block back under control. But the hatred between the wolves and the serpents had just crossed a line that no one could step back from. And deep inside Rikers, everyone, guards and inmates alike, felt the same thing. The next eruption was coming. The question wasn't if, it was when. The block was finally locked down. The floors were streaked with blood and water from hoses, the air still heavy with the sting of pepper spray. Inmates sat cuffed along the walls, heads down, some spitting curses, others gasping for breath. Correction officers moved through the smoke-filled corridor, dragging out the wounded, their boots crunching on broken shards of plastic and metal scraps left from the fight. But inside the cells, behind the steel bars, the war wasn't over. It was just changing form. The wolves and the serpents had been separated, scattered across different tiers and housing units. The officers thought this would stop the violence. But in Rikers, distance doesn't kill loyalty or revenge. Notes began to slip under doors, folded into tiny squares. Messages whispered through the vents, passed from one cell to another. Contraband phones lit up in the dark. Plans were already being made. The serpents swore to take out the wolf who had betrayed his own crew. To them, he wasn't just a traitor to his gang. He had crossed the invisible line of prison honor. And that was punishable by death. Meanwhile, the wolves gathered in whispers, furious that one of their own had turned against them in the middle of battle. Was he working with the Serpents? Was he playing both sides? No one could agree. But they did agree on one thing. Someone was going to pay. The correction officers sensed it too. They doubled the patrols, checked cells more often, but it didn't matter. The gangs always found a way. Every glance across the yard, every coded phrase in the chow line, carried the weight of a storm waiting to break. Days later, during evening rec, the tension snapped again. The Serpents spotted the traitor, the wolf who had turned on his own, sitting alone on a bench. Slowly they moved in. At first it looked casual, just men talking. But then, one Serpent pulled a blade from his shoe. What happened next would make the previous brawl look small in comparison. The rec yard was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that hides danger. Inmates milled around, some pacing the edges, others lifting weights, but everyone felt the tension. Eyes kept darting toward the center, where the wolf who had betrayed his own sat on a concrete bench, staring at the ground. He looked calm, but everyone knew his time was running out. The Serpents moved like shadows. 3 of them broke away from the crowd, circling closer. One adjusted his shoe, slipping a sharpened piece of metal into his palm. Another tugged his sleeve, hiding a blade taped to his wrist. The rest of the yard pretended not to see. In Rikers, silence is survival. The first strike came fast. The traitor barely had time to stand before the blade slashed across his side. He shouted, stumbling backward, hands flying up in shock. The second Serpent lunged, stabbing toward his chest. Chaos erupted instantly. Shouts, curses, bodies rushing. Correction officers sprinted toward the scene, radios blaring, but they were too far. The wolves saw what was happening and charged across the yard. They weren't about to let their member fall without a fight, even if he was a traitor. Fists flew, men collided, and suddenly the yard exploded into another battlefield. Officers tackled bodies, swinging batons, trying to drag men down. Alarms screeched across the yard. Tear gas popped, filling the air with a burning cloud. Inmates coughed, covered their faces, but the fighting kept going. The traitor, bleeding and weak, collapsed onto the concrete. Officers pulled him out just in time, dragging him through the gates as the wolves and Serpents tore at each other once more. Sirens wailed as more guards stormed in, shoving men to the ground, cuffing them, forcing them back into lines. When it was finally over, dozens of inmates were injured. Some needed stretchers, others carried away in restraints. The traitor survived, barely, but his fate was sealed. Inside Rikers, survival wasn't just about living through the day. It was about whether anyone would stand by you tomorrow. That night, the cell blocks echoed with silence, broken only by distant shouts and the clanging of doors. Both the wolves and the Serpents had taken heavy losses, but neither side was done. Everyone inside Rikers knew the truth. This war had no winners, only survivors. And when loyalties turn deadly, there's no such thing as peace. Only the next battle,